How many slaves were there in China, and how, and as a percentage as well? Is that known?
The general thinking is that the the largest percentage that we can think of is probably only about 2% of the population at any given time. And for a dynasty like the Sung dynasty, the period from the 10th century to the 13th centuries of the Common Era, the population at that time, by about the mid 12th century, about 1150, probably was about 120 million people. So consequently, 2%, we're talking um, somewhere in the neighborhood of um, 200 to 2 million to 3 million slaves as part of the population. And then you have all sorts of variation. For instance, in Korea, we at the basically by about the 17th century, uh, slaves, and these are all endogenous slaves, by the way, constituted somewhere between 30 and 35% of the population. So Korea was a slave society, quote, slave society, in a way that China never was.
Um, and within, for example, Korea and China, but also the US, how different was maybe the view on a slave, or uh, the uh, the the life of a slave also? So I would assume in some countries it was harsher than in others.
Yeah, that would seem to be true. And it probably varied a great deal. Um, given, and speaking about the East Asian context, given that the life of commoners could be quite brutal, uh, I would envision that the lives of slaves was uh, quite arduous, quite quite arduous. There were some exceptions, particularly in the arena of official slavery. Um, China, Korea, and even Vietnam had the practice of eunuchs who were in fact slaves. Uh, and these individuals, because of their proximity to the emperor and their lives at the court, uh, probably had a much better, a much less arduous existence. You know. But of course, um, there were many sacrifices that were made for that, and of course, eunuchism being the most prominent of them.
And again, trying to put it into contrast, slavery in the Western world and in Asia. How different was it?
I think it was different largely based on the fact that in the West, eventually slavery became race based.
That wasn't the case in Asia.
And that was not the case, uh, not in East Asia. And consequently, Western slavery has a kind of conspicuousness that East Asian slavery never really had.